There comes a moment when you simply stop chasing, not out of pride, but out of exhaustion. You realize that giving your all will never be enough for someone who only shows up when they need something. And then silence becomes your answer, absence your shield, and peace, finally, your priority. But what happens when this moment involves someone you love? How do you carry the weight of a decision that feels selfish, but is actually an act of freedom? Today, you'll hear the story of Rebecca, a woman who learned the hard way that saying no can also be an act of self-respect. And perhaps her story might sound a lot like yours. For years, Rebecca lived as if everything were under control. The kind of person who always knew what to say, where to be, how to act to avoid conflict and preserve peace. But that peace, unlike what many believed, was a minefield of silent compromises. She learned early on that silence could avoid shouting, that a smile could deflect criticism, and that constant presence could hold together bonds that were already unraveling. No one told her, though, that living to please others is the fastest way to lose yourself. At 39, Rebecca looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back. It wasn't a sudden crisis, nor an explosive moment. It was accumulation. Small wounds stacked over time, unanswered pleas, boundaries crossed under the excuse of love or keeping the peace. The day she chose not to answer the call from someone who only reached out when they needed something. It wasn't out of anger. It was the beginning of a silent cry. I matter too. In many relationships, romantic, familial, or professional, an invisible cycle takes hold. One gives, the other takes. One yields, the other demands. And if the cycle goes uninterrupted, it becomes a norm. The lack of resistance becomes permission. Rebecca spent years saying yes when her body was screaming no, until her health began to falter. Her sleep vanished, and a constant feeling of owing something lingered, despite having no debts. She stopped going places she loved because someone frowned upon it. She avoided talking about her goals, afraid of being called selfish. And when she finally left a message unread, one that began with, "Can you help me with a small thing?" the world around her grew suspicious, as if she had done something wrong, simply for doing something for herself. It's strange how people only notice your presence when you choose to be absent. Rebecca began to embrace silence, not from resentment, but from self-preservation. And that's when others' resentment appeared. They said she had changed, that she wasn't the same always available friend anymore. But no one asked why she had distanced herself. No one took the time to understand what was behind her silence. It's in these moments that you discover who's in your life out of affection and who's there out of convenience. Walking away is never easy. Guilt rushes in like an avalanche. Was I too harsh? What if they really needed me? These questions play on a loop in the mind. But there's a fine line between being supportive and becoming someone else's emotional sponge. When you absorb everything from others and leave nothing for yourself, something must change. Rebecca learned this when she began to say, "Not today. I need to care for myself now." Or simply, no, and each no turn like a key in the lock of an invisible prison. This isn't about turning your back on those you love. It's about realizing that love cannot come at the cost of your own exhaustion. There's a vast difference between being available and being submissive, and many confuse empathy with obligation. Rebecca's absence began to teach more than her silent presence ever could, because sometimes real care begins with a full stop, when you stop explaining and finally choose not to keep trying. Rebecca never studied ancient philosophy, but in practice, she was rediscovering Stoicism without even realizing it. In the silence she chose to keep, there was something profoundly Stoic. The refusal to react to external impulses and the decision to focus only on what was within her control, her choices, her peace, her integrity. Her absence, far from being revenge, was an act of inner discipline. And it was in that space of distance that she came to understand one of life's simplest yet harshest truths. No one will respect you if you don't respect yourself first. The Stoic is not dragged by uncontrollable emotions nor by the hunger for others' validation. And that is exactly what Rebecca began to cultivate. Each time she felt the urge to reply to a message just to maintain fragile connections, she would take a deep breath and ask herself, am I doing this for me or out of fear of being rejected? And if fear was the answer, she chose silence. Because fear, when it governs our actions, enslaves us. Living to avoid rejection is a refined way of disappearing. One Sunday lunch, a day when she would usually absorb complaints, and pretend everything was fine, Rebecca made a different choice. She showed up, but only to observe. No shielding others from conflict. No playing mediator. The discomfort in the air was immediate, not because she was rude. Quite the opposite. She remained polite, but she was different. And that difference unsettled those who were used to controlling her through guilt. That moment was liberating. Because when you shift your stance, those who relied on your submission lose their grip. And those who truly care finally start to see you for who you are. Stoicism teaches us that our value doesn't lie in how others treat us, but in how firmly we uphold our principles, even when the world pressures us to bend. Rebecca learned this at her core. She stopped justifying her decisions. She stopped pouring her energy into people who only showed up when it suited them. And most importantly, she stopped trying to fix what wasn't hers to fix. How often do we carry burdens that don't belong to us? How many times do we offer ourselves as bridges to people who never intended to cross? In the midst of this new phase, she began rediscovering small joys, reading a book without being interrupted by demands, sleeping without guilt, reorganizing her own routine without needing to check anyone else's preferences. And slowly, a quiet peace began to settle, not loud, not dramatic, but solid, the kind of peace that comes when you know you're doing what's right, even if no one claps for it. Because in the end, the greatest reward for honoring your boundaries isn't external praise. It's internal alignment. If you've made it this far, it's because something within you resonates with this journey. And maybe you're facing a similar crossroad between continuing to please or stepping back to protect your soul. So, I want to invite you to do two things right now. First, subscribe to this channel, but don't do it out of impulse. Subscribe if this message is truly reaching you, if these reflections are echoing inside you. Second, leave a comment below with honesty. When was the last time you stepped away from someone or something out of love for yourself? Share without fear, without filters. Your story might be the turning point in someone else's life. Someone still stuck on autopilot, just like Rebecca once was. The days went by, and little by little, Rebecca stopped missing those who, in truth, were never truly present. Not because she had become cold, but because she had matured emotionally. She understood that presence without respect is merely absence in disguise. And more than that emotional neediness is no excuse to remain in places that drain your soul. This isn't harshness. It's emotional responsibility toward oneself. What looks like indifference is often just someone who stopped begging for crumbs and chose to be nourished by their own dignity. There was a time when Rebecca confused being useful with being loved. Always available, always agreeable. But love that must be earned through constant effort is never real. It's a transaction. Stoicism, in its essence, calls us to freedom. Not the freedom to do whatever we please, but the freedom to no longer be slaves to opinions, demands, or the fear of loneliness. And that's how Rebecca began to live. Free. Free from the need to meet expectations she never agreed to. Free from the guilt of disappointing those who only drew near to take. Free from a fear of seeming selfish for choosing herself. This transformation didn't happen over a weekend. It was a process. And like all processes, it came with setbacks and doubt. There were days she wondered if she was going too far, if she was being too harsh. But with every attempt to return to the old patterns, she felt drained, as if her very body was saying, "You no longer belong there." And that's something few people talk about when it comes to growth. It hurts because you begin to outgrow the roles others assign to you. One day, a friend asked her why she had become more reserved, more selective. She smiled and replied simply, "Because now I understand the price of my peace." That phrase, seemingly simple, was the fruit of hard-earned wisdom. Peace, for Rebecca, was no longer a romantic ideal. It became a daily practice. Peace became not responding to messages that crossed her boundaries. It became declining invitations that left her feeling empty. It became speaking less and listening more to her body, her limits, her intuition. And here lies a deeper lesson. This isn't about cutting ties out of anger. It's about building new ties with yourself. Strong ones, rooted in truth and self-respect. The courage to walk away from those who don't value you is also the courage to move closer to those who truly see you, without requiring you to constantly explain who you are. This is the Stoic virtue of emotional moderation. Not coldness, not explosion, just clarity. If you saw yourself in Rebecca's story, maybe you're standing at the edge of a similar change. And if you are, know this, you don't have to walk through it alone. Here, on this channel, we grow together. We share. We stumble, yes, but we learn with each step. So, with all the warmth in the world, I invite you to subscribe, but not just as a spectator, as someone who belongs to a community that values truth, self-knowledge, and inner freedom. And now, if you feel called, share your story with us. Have you ever needed to step away from someone to protect your peace? What did you learn from it? How did it feel the first time you said no and realized the world didn't fall apart? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Let's build this space as a mirror of real stories and sincere growth. What you share might just help someone who is standing exactly where you once stood. If this message resonated with you in any way, take a deep breath. Maybe this is the beginning of a new chapter, more conscious, more yours. And if you felt that, now is the perfect time to subscribe to the channel. Not out of obligation, but because you truly want to walk with us on this path of self-awareness and inner freedom. Also, leave a like, not to boost numbers, but to help this message reach others who, like you, are seeking to live with more honesty. And share your thoughts in the comments below from the heart. When was the moment you chose your peace, even if it meant disappointing someone? Your story matters. And it might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. See you in the next video with more clarity, more presence, and more stoicism in practice. Until then,